MLB offseason got off to an interesting start with a rare player-for-player trade involving the New York Mets centered around Marcus Semien and Brandon Nimmo. I do want to break down what this does mean from the Phillies angle and if it could force the hands of another notable move within the NL East. I think there's an interesting case being made in an article that I do want to dive into here and reflect into why, in the grand scheme of things, I don't think this means a ton from the Phillies' perspective. These are two guys, and to lay out their stats, that we're seeing a Brandon Nimmo season in which he's coming off 25 home runs, 92 RBIs, a 324 on-base percentage, walked 50 times at 154 hits across 587 at-bats, and to compare that with what we got from Marcus Semien here, coming off a 15 home run, 62 RBI season, a 305 on-base percentage, had 108 hits across 470 at-bats, a 364 slugging percentage. That, to me, sort of the root of this is sort of trading bad money for bad money here, that I think both these guys don't have contracts that are very desirable to have on your books, and sometimes a change of scenery can spark that. But let's hear the case out and do want to dive into what is being said. I believe this article is from Phillies Nation here, which starts off stating how Mets' bizarre blockbuster trade could still come back to bite the Phillies. Stephen Cohen is getting ready to open up his wallet, and the case that is made is, while the Philadelphia Phillies fans are still waiting for the first moves of the offseason, the divisional rival New York Mets got busy on Sunday evening. As broken by ESPN's Jeff Passan, the Mets sent outfielder Brandon Nimmo to the Texas Rangers for second baseman Marcus Semien. Trading away Nimmo didn't just subtract the longest tenured Met of 10 seasons, it also opened a spot up in the Mets outfield, possibly for New York to seriously pursue Kyle Tucker, the top free agent hitter on the market, or maybe Cody Bellinger. And it continues on to write, the Mets are taking on the $72 million remaining on Semien's contract for his age 35 to 37 seasons. The trade-off, as Anthony DiComo notes, is that acquiring Semien helps the Mets improve their defense and increase their roster flexibility. DiComo reports that the Mets are considering all options in the outfield, from using internal choices like Jeff McNeil or number 2 prospect Carson Benji to going after one of the big free agent outfielders like Tucker or Bellinger. According to his source, the Mets are considering all of this avenue. So sort of the angle that is being taken here is this was a prerequisite move, that they want to open up a slot for a potential big name in Kyle Tucker or Cody Bellinger here, and then that could not be done without Brandon Nimmo being traded. Now, I will note, like, if we are just going to directly compare those players, I do think it's fairly close. I think Marcus Semien certainly on the back end of his career. I think Brandon Nimmo is a fine baseball player. He's not a guy who struck fear into me. I'm not like, I'm so glad this guy is away from New York and the Phillies do not have to face this guy as many times as you do when they are in the division, like with the Mets there. But I think he was totally fine, totally capable, and a guy that did help their team overall. But I think he was a net positive player, and I think that has gotten a little bit lost in this conversation here. But nonetheless, sort of a whole bunch of nothing from the move in particular, which is why this is sort of inching at, does this mean that Kyle Tucker could be the second shoe that does fall? And to make that case a little further, the article continues on to write, the Mets trade means the Phillies might have to deal with Kyle Tucker or Cody Bellinger in the NL East. And it writes, obviously the Mets landing Tucker would be bad news for the Phillies and the rest of the NL East. Bellinger wouldn't have as big of an impact, but would still make the Mets much better. Either way, the trade isn't great news for the Phillies. Tucker is easily the biggest free agent positional player on the market this winter. The Phillies have been connected to the 5-tool outfielder already as well, but that rumor always comes with the caveat that they'd have to lose Kyle Schwarber to make a serious push for Tucker. Instead, now there is a clear path for Mets owner Steve Cohen and the president of baseball operations David Stearns to spend money this offseason as they try to shape up the core of a team that embarrassingly missed the postseason. In his analysis of MLB.com, Marcus Feinstein notes that this clearly puts Tucker and Bellinger in the Mets' sights. And to put up the final portion of this, it writes, quote, trading Nimmo certainly creates a vacancy in the Mets outfield, Feinstein writes, and given the widespread belief that there was already planning to make a big push for Tucker and or Bellinger, this deal makes it all but certain that they will try to sign one of those two outfielders. We all know that Cohen isn't afraid to spend big money. He handed the richest contract to Juan Soto last offseason and looks poised to do what he can to add to the payroll this time around. Despite having a strong debut year from Soto, the Mets folded like a cheap suit. That couldn't have sat well with Cohen, which makes him and the Mets all that more dangerous this offseason. And that is probably the portion that I would push back a little bit. I mean, we saw them make the big splash for Juan Soto. We also saw this team have a ton of flaws this season, from the pitching to the bullpen. Edwin Diaz, they just were not good enough any way that you did cut it. And they lost Diaz already this offseason. That is a guy who opted out of his contract here. I just don't see enough for me to look at this Mets team and think that team strikes fear into me. And any way that I circle this conversation back to the Phillies here, it all has to look at internally. There are things that this team has to do to improve. But just about every issue that is the case, I think is on the Phillies. That I'm not looking at other organizations, especially not the Mets, saying we have to beat that. If there is a team that is the gold standard, it is the Dodgers. That is the hill that you got to climb. That is the pinnacle that you have to reach from a talent perspective, and that is a far more difficult process than ultimately what is the case in New York right now. Now, with that being said, to take a look at the Phillies roster right now, there is no doubt that it is incomplete. We've talked a lot about the pitching. We've talked a lot about the rumors that have sort of arose to this point. I do think that we are now going to be hitting hot rumor season where we should start to see things heat up a little bit. And there are still plenty of issues that need to be figured out. It starts with the outfield. That if you want to talk about a place for Kyle Tucker, and I'm not the number one Kyle Tucker guy in the world, but take a look at this outfield and tell me he would be head and shoulders the best talent that there is. Currently, looking at the outfield depth chart that we are seeing, and this just coming from ESPN here, we're talking about Nick Castellanos, Otto Kemp, Johan Rojas, and Brandon Marsh as the options. Now I'll throw in the caveat that I think it's pretty locked in stone that Justin Crawford is going to be a portion of this conversation, but none of those options are particularly good enough in my eyes. And Nick Castellanos, it seems like there is just about no doubt that that will be the next guy out of this organization. It does not seem like there is much of a pathway whatsoever to him returning right there, and that is probably the first shoe that I expect to drop from the offseason perspective. That we're starting to see the rumor mill flow, the pen hitting paper and deals being struck. I do think that there will be a conclusion to the Castellanos outcome before we start to see whether it is a Dallas Garcia type of swing, a buy low type opportunity. There's a lot that still needs to go down. And I'm not, intimidated by the Mets bringing in Marcus Semien, even if it is to pave way for a bigger deal in the outfield right here. So still a lot more questions than it answers when it comes to this Phillies offseason, but I'm not going to be shaking in my boots about the Mets potentially spending money. If they're going to give all of it in its entirety, they're just going to do it. You can't stop Steve Cohen from spending his money. And I will note like a similar characteristic that I think both Kyle Tucker and Juan Soto hold. They're damn good baseball players, but boy, do they both just exude loser energy. And I think Kyle Tucker is even worse at it than Juan Soto. And I think Mets fans even noticed it with Juan Soto last year. I saw plenty of criticism, particularly in the early part of the season right there. Tucker is even more obnoxious. I got a good buddy that's a Cubs fan that cannot wait for Kyle Tucker to be leaving. And that's insane when you think back to they traded like high ticket prospects to bring this guy in. He was there for one season and there's not even a consideration for should we re-sign this guy? Can we bring him back? Now, some of that is purely financial, but a lot of it is the fan base being like, we've had enough of this guy. I kind of want that dude in New York to some extent. And I get it. The numbers are the numbers. The back of the baseball card is the back of the baseball card. The dude is absolutely a talented baseball player. But if they're just collecting talented guys that are just complete losers up there, I can live with that from a Mets perspective. That is not the direction that I want the Phillies to go down, and I'm encouraged that that is not. That there is more will to win in Bryce Harper than any of Kyle Schwarber, Juan Soto, and whoever else you want to throw in that list from that Mets roster. Now, they still have good players. Francisco Lindor is the real deal. Pete Alonso, very curious how that ultimately resolves itself, what that outcome is. We will see. A lot more questions than answers. We're still at the beginning of the offseason, and interesting that was the launching point from New York. So we'll see how things shake out, but I don't necessarily think that the Phillies should be panicked over a deal that sent away Brandon Nimmo and brought in Marcus Semien. I think it was trading bad money for bad money, opened up a little bit more flexibility, variety there, and at the bottom line, like if we're just going to call it about the deal specifically, I think made the team slightly worse. So we'll see how things do shake out. The Phillies still got plenty of issues to deal with internally here, but don't be too worried about a small deal that at the end of this offseason, we likely forget about that one. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. And is your level of fear if the Mets give Kyle Tucker more significant than mine? For me personally, that would be kind of my reaction would be it's a little bit of a bummer, but not something that really intimidates me about that team. Tell me if you think I'm crazy and I'm really underselling his impact. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments. Appreciate you guys tuning in this video as always. If you have not already, make sure you're hitting that like button, dropping a subscribe to the channel. I'll be back talking to you next time right here on Phillies Digest. Peace.